Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you. Another kind of cold, late fall, almost wintry night to spend together. It is a real pleasure to be gathering together to learn this evening. We have two wonderful speakers, or as one of them might prefer, a great speaker and an able facilitator, perhaps. We're just all so excited to have you here and again to learn together this evening. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I am the Director of Adult Education here at Central Synagogue. And I am joining this evening our speaker and our other speaker or facilitator. Our main speaker tonight on Abraham Joshua Heschel, A Life of Radical Amazement, is Dr. Julian E. Zelizer. Dr. Zelizer is a professor at Princeton University and is considered one of the pioneers in the revival of American political history. At Princeton, he serves as the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs. Dr. Zelizer is also a CNN political analyst. You may recognize him and his background from there. He's also a regular guest on NPR's Here and Now, where you probably won't recognize his background from. He's the author or editor of 22 books, including this newest book on Abraham Joshua Heschel. He has written over 1,000 op-eds. He's written articles. He has participated in multiple fellowships and received many awards, and it is our honor and pleasure to host him this evening. Our other speaker and presenter this evening is Rabbi Ari Lorge, our very own. Rabbi Lorge has been at Central Synagogue since 2013 when he was ordained a rabbi at the Cincinnati campus of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Rabbi Lorge graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, which for me is a very important data point. He also won multiple prizes in his rabbinical school career and has been in leadership positions at Central Synagogue and in the New York Rabbinate, as well as within the Reform world in the time that he has been at Central Synagogue. So it is my pleasure to turn over for all of our learning pleasure this evening to Dr. Zelizer and Rabbi Lorge.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Berman and Dr. Zelizer. Thank you so much for being with us tonight and for spending the evening with us. You have written this wonderful, incredible biography of Abraham Joshua Heschel. For some of, I would venture to say some of the people who are listening have heard of Abraham Joshua Heschel, but for those who maybe are new to him and his work, he's a figure with many titles: rabbi, intellectual, scholar, activist, just to name a few. You could argue that he's one of the most important Jewish leaders of the 20th century. And you've brought his life into incredible relief in this volume. You've given other talks about this biography that you've written, where you have summarized and spoken about the biography, and I would encourage folks who are joining us tonight to seek out those talks, or even better, to read the book. But we're hoping that tonight we'll have a slightly different conversation, more focused about what Heschel and his writing, and you in the process of writing this volume, what Heschel has come to mean to you, and maybe what Heschel has to say to us today. I have a lot of questions I'm very eager to ask, and I would say for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, feel free to add questions you have in the chat at any point, and Rabbi Berman will be collecting those, and we'll have a chance for some Q&A. We'll democratize the question asking towards the end of the session. But I'd love just to start by asking you to let us know how an eminent professor of American political history came to write a biography about Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be with everyone. Thanks for having me for this event. It's nice and an honor to speak to such a wonderful synagogue. And it's a good question. How did a political historian end up writing about Abraham Joshua Heschel? There's a couple reasons, more than a couple. One was I wrote a book on the Great Society a few years ago, and a lot of it was about civil rights politics in the early and mid 1960s. And one of the themes that really came out of that work was the role of religious leaders and religious organizations, from Black preachers to other religious leaders, even in places such as the Midwest, in rural areas, who really were quite central to the social justice politics of the decade. And stuck in my head, it was a small part of my book, but I wanted to really explore that through a person. A second reason is I am an observant Jew. I grew up as the son of a rabbi, the grandson of a rabbi. So Heschel is a figure I had encountered many times, like many of you, either hearing about him in a sermon or reading a snippet of something that he wrote in the Siddur, or seeing the famous photograph from Selma. And so when this opportunity arose, I thought it was a great way to really explore this period in American Jewish history, and to understand and bring to life a figure we're all familiar with, but whose life as a whole is still a bit of a mystery for most people. And I'm very glad I did it, and that's what brought me here.
I wondered if you might tell us a little bit more about the dedication of the book. I'm not going to assume that everyone has the book in front of them, and so I'll just share it quickly. You wrote, "This book is dedicated to the late Nathan Zelizer and his son Gerald, my grandfather and father, who both taught me what it means to live a Jewish life and showed me the central role that rabbis play in our historic community." Would you be able to share a little bit more about the two of them and maybe how they play a part in this story too?
Sure. So that dedication is to my grandfather, Nathan Zelizer, the late Rabbi Nathan Zelizer, who was a rabbi in Columbus, Ohio, for many decades. And also, after he retired, moved to South Florida, but wasn't the retiring kind of person, and started a number of synagogues in that area before passing away. And he was really very influential, not just as a rabbi and a Jewish leader, but he also is very involved in all sorts of civic action and civic activity throughout his career. You know, back in Columbus, fighting for rent control and dealing with issues of civil rights, to the end of his life where he used to drive around with the police and counsel people who were being arrested. So he is the first person it's dedicated to. My father was a rabbi in Metuchen, New Jersey, as a conservative synagogue. He was also the president of the Rabbinical Assembly. So I grew up in this rabbinic family, which made me very attuned not just to what Judaism was, but how it evolved and its history, especially the conservative movement, and their lives both intersected a bit. My father took classes with Heschel at JTS and shared some stories with me about their interaction. And there's a moment in my book where my father is being ordained as a rabbi. My grandfather is on the stage receiving an honorary doctorate. And it's the same year King is also there, Martin Luther King, and Heschel sitting on the stage. So there are moments of convergence in the book as well. And that's the personal dimension of what I wrote about. I'd say one more thing. Growing up in that atmosphere, as many people do, I heard lots of conversations and ideas about how do you keep contemporary Jews connected to Jewish institutions, the perennial question that the Pew surveys are always asking. So that was always very much on my mind. And one of the fascinating things we'll discuss was that Heschel's approach to this and his answer to that grand question was very different than a lot of my father and grandfather's colleagues. And that really intrigued me.
No, I definitely want to delve into that for sure. But before we do that, maybe you'd be good enough to share, and maybe it's not a single moment, but sort of your Heschel origin story. He is an active force, a present force in the life of your grandfather and father. But for you, what was your first encounter with Heschel? It sounds like you grew up with his words around you, but was there a work you encountered? Is there a story there?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was actually the photograph, and I had encountered his words, and I had heard, the one or two lines you often hear of Heschel, and I always found it very moving and inspiring. But I don't remember how old I was. It was in college, I think, where I first really started to learn about who he was, not just as a theologian, but as an activist. I remember seeing that photograph a long time ago, and I was just intrigued, like many people, by who is this rabbi with the long white beard, walking next to the king and John Lewis at Selma, and the look itself is dramatic. He looks prophetic, and it's stuck. It's a photograph that really stuck with me, but I put it away. And years later, actually, I had Rabbi Shai Held spoke at Princeton. I brought him to speak a little bit about his Heschel book. And I don't know if he remembers this, but we had a whole dinner conversation, and it came back to that photograph. And that really, for me, in some ways, was the foundation for unpacking who is this person, and how did he, an immigrant from Warsaw, end up on the streets of Selma in such a fraught moment. And the work I like, which I've really discovered as an adult, is the Sabbath. I know many people are moved by that book. I just find it a very powerful explanation of kind of why we demarcate and why we celebrate this day on Friday night and Saturday, and articulate it in a way that many people, I think, have trouble doing. Just the beauty of carving out time that's holy and that's sanctified and different from what we do the rest of the week.
One of the things that's really striking as I read this biography was just to, and I know this from my bookshelf anecdotally, but to just read about the output that he has in terms of the number of books that he puts out, but also the it's not a huge span of time that he's putting them out in. There's just incredible, and for him, it's not a first language, right? I mean, he's writing these incredibly evocative works, and many of them in a new tongue for him. Is there ever a moment where he expresses difficulty over this, or was this just burning inside of him and he had to get it out?
I mean, the language is natural and learned. So he is someone who is proficient in several languages. And as I studied him, it was just remarkable to watch the ease with which he could transition to different languages and not just speak them, but write in them, and often write quite beautifully. And I think the transition to English, which most of his books, obviously, that we all know in the 40s and 50s were written in that language, are quite powerful. And it was noted by reviewers all the time, just his skill, given this was not his native language. But he also learned it. I have a story in the book where while he's at the Hebrew Union College, which is his first stop in the United States, and he's there from 1940 to 1945, he's tutored by a student there who Heschel tutors him in Hebrew, and he tutors him in English. And he does it by giving him classic works in literature, from Moby Dick to Lincoln's addresses. And Heschel loves reading this, and it's part of how his skills rapidly improve. And I have a scene where one morning he sees this young student and says, his name is Herbert. He says, "Herbie, I dreamt in English." And he's ecstatic because he realizes, as he had done with so many languages, he had absorbed it. And that's the story of how he ended up. And I think it is a remarkable part of him. And he's very productive. I mean, during the 40s and 50s, especially, he is just constantly at work trying to unpack this theme of the relationship between God and man. And the prolific output is something that is a big part of his legacy.
And you mentioned the Sabbath being your favorite. Is that a fair thing to say, that that's your favorite volume of his?
I think it's one. I don't have a favorite, but I've read that several times over, especially in the course of this book. And I really enjoy it, not just for the book, but I must say just for the time in his life and connecting it to some of what he's trying to figure out at that moment.
And since, you immersed yourself not just in his life and his biography, but also so clearly his works, is there anything that's changed for you, whether it's for your own Judaism, your own spiritual life, something that some way that this has impacted and changed you, this process of writing?
For sure. I mean, one of the principal parts of what I write about with Heschel is his insistence in the 40s and 50s through the 60s that American Jews and Jews all over the world had to focus on their spiritual inner life, and that we were in a culture in the United States, for sure, where we really privileged building institutions, and we really privileged in many ways building a Jewish social apparatus to keep people connected. But what comes through in all of his writing, not just in terms of being connected to Judaism, but what it meant to be pious, it really just was very moving and profound to read his thoughts about why opening oneself up to things beyond the self and to the wonders of the world, which is what radical amazement ultimately revolves around, was something I won't forget. And it's an element of Judaism. When we were at the high holidays this year, davening, it actually just came to my mind, not just that we daven, not just that we pray, but that we think about how we pray. And I think that's something that will really stick with me for a long time.
On that theme, there's a few stories in the book where his insistence on this doesn't necessarily earn him a fan base. You talk about it, I think, was it a convention of conservative rabbis where he sort of takes them to task just on this issue alone?
Oh yes, he was constantly in moments of friction with many of his colleagues and many of the people he was teaching through the JTS and conservative rabbis in the making. And he's very critical. I mean, this is a period, it's really interesting. In the 1940s and 50s, you have this very vigorous debate taking place in JTS, different perspectives on how to think and study Judaism. You have a group of scholars really focusing on Jewish law, halakha, and emphasizing the need to understand it, to contextualize it, to historicize it. But ultimately, that's the thread that holds us together. Mordechai Kaplan is also a prominent figure who's stressing the importance of the synagogue and building ethno-social institutions that will remain the fabric of Jewish life, which was very appealing, and I would argue remained very influential for rabbis in the United States, especially in the suburbs where these institutions are being built. But Heschel, he didn't think either was exactly the right answer, and he really focused on the spiritual inner life of each Jew, and made the argument that if conservative Judaism for sure didn't focus on this, as well as Reform Judaism, ultimately the essence of the community would wither and thin. And in 1953, he makes a speech at the convention, which is in Atlantic City that year, and he gives a really pretty blistering speech about rabbis. And he argues that they know how to do many things well. They've built beautiful synagogues. They can give, great ceremonial events they know how to put together. And he says their sermons often sound like, op-eds written about issues like NATO or government and the need for government. But what they don't do, he said, is teach people how to pray. And he asks in that speech if the synagogue will become the place where, I don't have the exact quote in my head, where prayer is buried. And it's very controversial. A lot of rabbis are upset with him. He doubles down and he publishes this and other thoughts on prayer in a book, but it will remain something he's very insistent on. And it does cause a lot of tension with rabbis who feel he's not appreciating the way they're trying to build the institutions of this country to preserve some of the same things he wants.
And this touches maybe on some of what you were alluding to at the beginning about some of these tensions within certainly JTS, which was his surroundings at the time. You outlined Kaplan, Heschel, and then sort of my sense is they're kind of two outliers where there's this more maybe predominant position around halakha. Does that sound fair as a characterization?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think one of the tremendous things about Heschel and Kaplan, while they may have been marginal figures in the sense that they weren't the majority opinion in that institution, is the two of them have had profound influences, not just over conservative Judaism, but I would say all American Judaism and maybe beyond. But could you talk a little bit more specifically about that tension between what Kaplan believed would really help preserve and propel Judaism versus the spirituality of Heschel's?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, Kaplan is more in tune with what younger rabbis are trying to build at the time, and it's a somewhat practical understanding of modern society, and that some of the demands of the Jewish tradition would be very hard to maintain. But what's interesting when you read Kaplan's writing is the importance of the synagogue as an institution itself, as a place where Judaism isn't just made, but it continues over generations. And people who've written about Kaplan and his legacy talk about him envisioning almost a synagogue center with all sorts of functions, but will keep bringing people in to this institution. It will be the basis of social and communal ethnic life. And Heschel is not against that. But for him, ultimately, what would happen inside those synagogues would not be fulfilling. I mean, in that speech that he gave, he said that services are conducted with dignity and precision. He said the rendition of the liturgy is smooth, everything is present, decorum, voice, and ceremony. But he said the only thing that was missing was life. And then he said, our motto is monotony. And that ultimately he came with that question, has the synagogue become the graveyard where prayer is buried? So also as his career progresses, obviously, he doesn't think it's just about prayer, and it's not just about practicing halakha the right way, but it's also ultimately about being engaged with the great social questions of the day. And his work on the Hebrew prophets will bring him to a place where to be a good Jew, to be a pious Jew, also meant engaging in the social struggles that were taking place all around him. And so that was different than a lot of what a lot of rabbinic life was about, which was really much more internal and internally focused.
Yes, I mean there is this whole section of his life that is certainly within the world of academia and training rabbis. There's this aspect where he is pleading for the community to take on a spiritual dimension in order to infuse life into Judaism. But it's not an internal, it's not just for the sake of our own internal spiritual life. Right. It seems for him this is a unified totality of his identity, that those things lead him to notice what is wrong with the society in which he's living and propels him to want to fix it. So what are some of the issues that he ends up, and again, not without controversy, speaking out on?
Well, I mean, let me just, for context, for people who don't know his story as much, just preface it by saying this is someone who had grown up in Warsaw in a Hasidic family, a family that came from a big rabbinic dynasty. He had left that world and he went to the University of Berlin, where he got a PhD in philosophy. He continued to train as a rabbi, and ultimately he's kicked out by the Gestapo in 1938, and he's saved by the Hebrew Union College and comes here in 1940 as a fellow. But in those years of the war, he lives through horror. Several members of his family, his mother and 3 sisters, are killed during the war. His friends, many friends are killed during the Holocaust. And he watches, communities that he grew up in wiped away. And one of his first books is really a eulogy for the world that was lost. And after the war, this is a person, a scholar, who's wrestling with how do you make sense of what just happened? In addition to the war and the Holocaust, he thinks all the time about atomic and nuclear weapons and how does this all fit in a world that's supposed to be civilized, in a world where science brought such great progress with things like vaccines? And how do you rectify modernity, his religious beliefs, and the horror that the world just lived through? And a lot of his writing, I think, that we're talking about is wrestling with this in one way or another. And part of what he does in the books, Man is Not Alone, which comes out in 1951, and God in Search of Man, which comes out in 1955, is argue that it's not just about the spiritual health of the Jewish community, and it's not just even about being a better person. He has this whole argument that God, a God that has pathos, that has love and compassion and anger, just like human beings, needs humans to make this world better. But he needs humans who can hear God. And the writing in those two books is about how does the individual open themselves up so that they could get beyond themselves and hear the voice of God and hear the things we are indifferent to, but which often enrages God. And that's ultimately for him what, practicing the mitzvot is about, what spirituality is about. It ultimately, it's not just making about the self better, it's the opposite. It's about ultimately being able to make the entire world better.
And I would say his spiritual clarity is matched by a moral clarity that they sort of reinforce each other. You speak about a few moments, but those of us who have read his work know that it's infused throughout his writings. But he talks about the absurdity of a conversation where we can decide whether or not gelatin is kosher or treif, but we have nothing to say on nuclear weapons, right? And
and this is pre-1960s. It's kind of interesting that he's already thinking of many of these questions. You could read, it's worth, I urge everyone actually just to refer back to the Sabbath, because it is a book about Shabbat, and it's about what that means in the Jewish tradition. But some of it is about, it could be written by many of the social critics of the period who were criticizing materialism and commerce and how much of a hold it had on this country. And he writes directly about this, that in fact, sanctifying 24 hours not to be part of all of that was extraordinarily important to creating a healthy kind of just frame of mind and just community. He's making, that's a famous story of an encounter with rabbinic students, but even in books like God in Search of Man, you can find several places where he's asking those exact kinds of questions. So this is a big part of my book. The writing is not separate from what he ends up doing in the 60s. In fact, the writing is kind of moving him toward a place of seeing why those movements are not disconnected from his theological ideas about the world.
Well, and one of the other points you're making, which is, you also can't separate this from his lived reality, going through seeing these worlds that were so rich disappear before his eyes through the Holocaust. And I remember one of the lines from your book that I just kind of had to put the book down and live with for a moment or two is when you talk about how Heschel spoke about the rule of thumb he had for his own behavior, and how I think the line was he asked himself, would it be acceptable to those who burned in the camps? Right, and that was a clarion guiding principle for him.
Very powerful. And I have a chapter on his time in Cincinnati, and some of his awakening to becoming involved. It comes during those periods, and it's connected to that question he used to ask, because he starts to participate in political activity during the war. And a lot of what he's focused on, most of what he's focused on, is protesting the fact that so many Americans were doing nothing about Jewish refugees. And he was aware from his family exactly what was going on. And too many American Jews were not really mobilizing as aggressively as they should. And he participates in a number of events. He goes to a huge rally in Madison Square Garden where prominent speakers talk about this. He participates in something called the Rabbis March, where 400 Orthodox rabbis marched from Union Station to different parts of DC, meeting with senators and legislators, trying to meet with President Roosevelt unsuccessfully, and going to the Lincoln Memorial, actually, where they, chant the mourner's Kaddish and also sing traditional Jewish songs in the tune of the Star Spangled Banner and other kind of Americana that people were familiar with. And that was very moving to him. It was connected with that question he was already thinking about: how should his own life unfold in relation to what they were living through? But he was always frustrated because he'd go back to Cincinnati and he'd realize when the rally ended, when the rabbis' march ended, nothing happened. And he was haunted by that. And later in his life, whether it was civil rights or Soviet Jewry, he was always asking that exact question. And that was a guide for how he had to live, not just politically, but individually as well. And I think, again, even if it's not directly what he's writing about, it's always part of what's shaping his thoughts.
And it's, it strikes me, it's a remarkable thing that we could continue to ask ourselves as Jews. This guiding principle of him could be a guiding principle for us. And, he forces, or at least asks, requires the community he's living with, the Jewish community, to really just face down some of these, what were, controversial issues at the time, right? These are, we look back at them now, and perhaps we think there is a clear sense of what ought to be done in that historical moment. But, he was often taking, we have to remind ourselves, unpopular positions. It sounds like from the book, especially around Vietnam. Is that right?
Yes, that's of everything. But I'll talk. There are some other issues, even Soviet Jewry, where he was really, in some ways, clashing with members of his own community.
And so he's asking the community to look where they're reluctant to look and to do what they're reluctant to do. It's really, as you said, a prophetic call. He's inspired by these prophets. But if he was alive today, where do you think he'd be asking us to look as a Jewish community?
I think he would look in both directions that he wrote about. Some of it would not be about the political questions we all speak about. He would continue to be writing and talking to the Jewish community about maintaining and strengthening their spiritual core. And that would be related to the question and the quote that you read. There's a quote in the book that I always think about. He said, Auschwitz is a manifestation of what a world without God is capable of doing. So he would start with the spirituality. He would start today with the religion, I assume, and you can't speak for someone who's passed away, but he would be imploring us to keep working on this element of Jewish life for all of our health. But clearly, he'd be also engaged in some of the big social problems that were around in the 60s and continue to this day, whether questions of racial justice, whether it's questions of economic inequality. These were concerns then, and there's no reason to believe that they would have disappeared. And he'd be very concerned about what is the United States doing overseas, and are we using our power in the right ways, or are we using them in ways that erode our own society and that of others?
And he's a unique figure in the community at the time. There's not a lot of other rabbinic figures that we could point to that filled these many different roles, but who are his cadre? Who does he speak with? Who does he debate with? Where is the where are the circles that he's engaging in?
He has he has his family. He has a group at JTS who he's very close with throughout. One is someone named Wolf Kelman, who was essentially the executive director of the Jewish Theological Seminary, also came from an Orthodox background. His son went on to be a prominent rabbi in Jerusalem who was very involved in human rights. Kelman was someone who he trusted very much, and who he kind of opened his personal self to. And Marshall Meyer was another figure who was a student at JTS, who Heschel became very close with, and Meyer became very interested in some of these human rights questions. He ended up being a rabbi in Buenos Aires, and someone Heschel was close to as well. He has non-rabbinic friends who are very important to him. Reinhold Niebuhr is one of the most important. Niebuhr is one of the great theologians of the period, a prominent philosopher who taught at the Union Seminary, and he gives Heschel one of his first big reviews. He reviews Man is Not Alone in 51 in the New York Herald, before Heschel is really a prominent figure. And Niebuhr writes in this review that Heschel is going to be one of the most important figures in American religious thought. And they form a close friendship. They like to walk down Riverside Drive after work. They would discuss philosophy. They would discuss their families. They would discuss theology. And then there's a group during the Vietnam period who he's very close to, people like John Bennett, who form with him this group of clergy who mobilized very early on against the Vietnam War. And finally, obviously, was Martin Luther King. And they forged a very special relationship in January of 1963 that will last through King's assassination. And that relationship in many ways came to embody Heschel and his fusion of theology and political activism.
One of the last books he writes is an exploration of two Hasidic schools of thought, and it sounds rather esoteric and not particularly relevant until you start reading the book and his discussion of these two schools of thought. But he describes them as these two schools of thought that are constantly at odds within his soul and constantly pushing and pulling him. And that's the thought and the legacy of the Baal Shem Tov and the thought and the legacy of the Kotzker Rebbe. Would you be able to kind of just unpack that big idea for us and help us understand sort of what that wrestling was, and why he is explaining these two modes of thought to the American Jewish community and what he felt we needed to learn about it? Because I think most of us haven't heard about, this aspect of Heschel's life or work.
Well, they're both rabbinic traditions that he was taught as a kid, and they were really, as he was being mentored in Warsaw to be a rabbi, first he's taught primarily the work or the stories of the Baal Shem Tov, which really revolved around these stories of the need to be compassionate to others, acknowledging human fallibility, talking about the tzaddik, the pious person, and the role that they had in uplifting the community and the essential goodness of every individual. And this was a kind of thought that was very important growing up, that he learned from his father before his father passes away when he's very young. And then there's this other tradition that he learns after his father passes away from the person who takes over his tutoring. And it's this tradition of the Kotzker rabbi, which has a much bleaker view of humans, of individuals, of capable really of doing bad things, and a much bleaker outlook about the condition, the human condition. And he too stresses a way out of that and talks about a kind of religion and piety as a way to overcome that. But it's two very different ways in which young Heschel, as he grew into old Heschel, thought about what Judaism had to say about humans in this respect. And he writes this toward the end of his life, and it's really his most autobiographical book. He's looking at these two traditions that have been so important, so influential, that are contradictory in many ways. And I think he's trying to work out how both in many ways work together.
And what's the resolution for us? He writes to teach, not necessarily, but I think, he to teach in the sense of a sermon, not to teach in the sense of an academic book, right? So
Yeah.
what's the message for us?
Well, I think, and this connects to what he did. I think, both were perspectives he actually had. And I think it comes back still to these questions of why it's so imperative to be spiritual and to work in ways personally that move you beyond self. Because whether there's a lot of goodness in the world or whether there is also real evil in the world, ultimately that activity of improving one's own spiritual life and ultimately connecting to making modern society better are the way out of that. And I'll just, when he first meets King, it's in 1963, and he gives this speech at a convention in Chicago in January of interfaith leaders about religion and race. And it's a great speech to read, and it connects to what we're talking about, because Heschel talks about racism, and he has incredibly hard-hitting words about this issue. It's not all about the goodness of humankind, and it's not all about the possibilities of moving beyond racism. It's a speech where he is arguing that you can't be a religious person and a racist, that the two are inherently contradictory. He says racism is Satanism. It's an unmitigated evil. So he uses language throughout that talk, which would be very familiar to someone who studied that Kotzker tradition. But ultimately, there was that other element that he saw when he marched on the streets of Selma and when he formed this kind of kinship with the civil rights leaders of the period. And I think in that book and others, he's pointing to both traditions as being important. But what he writes in God in Search of Man is ultimately, I think, what he wants us to take away about what we have to do in that world.
So with all of the critique and all of the aspiration that he lays out, where do where would you say we've done a good job listening and heeding, and where do you think we have some work to do?
Yeah, I mean, I do talk in the book about how since his time, some of this progressive religious tradition in politics has lost some of its hold. A lot of its hold. A lot of religious political activism has been much more closely associated with conservatism and the religious right. And I think his story and what he did, certainly as an activist, but in his writing as well, is something, the country could certainly use more of. I think it had many beneficiary effects, and it had a really important contribution to the struggle for social justice in our country and in terms of what we do overseas. And we definitely need more of that. I think those voices have really been eclipsed. There's some people, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, for example, of the organization Trua, or Reverend William Barber, who've been working hard to bring that back. But that's part of the story I wanted to tell. And then this other element of Heschel that we've really focused on, I think it doesn't have to be something everyone agrees on, but it has to be something, I think, that the American Jewish community engages in thinking about what is our inner life, and what does it mean to be a Jew in terms of the way we live every single day and the way we think about the world around us, and these grand philosophical questions that he put on the table in terms of how do we become more pious are questions that are desperately needed. I mean, we have lived through traumatic, horrible times in the last few years. That's something we can all agree with, even though people have different perspectives on why. And so those questions we can't stop asking them. I mean, how after a pandemic that has caused so much human devastation and so much devastation to the social fabric of the world, the questions he was asking after World War II are incredibly pertinent. How could this all happen in a world where we can also create vaccines and we can also have this internet that can, connects us everywhere. And those answers point to the kinds of writing that he already has to offer and which are available for all of us to read.
I think we would many of us be surprised if we were to dust some of his volumes off the shelf at how modern, contemporary, I should say, they read, how relevant they read, both for the issues of materialism and opulence, but in reading something recently, he talks about the embarrassment we might feel as a society looking around at us with the incredible potential and ability we have, and yet where we choose to place that, and to the kinds of issues we choose not to tackle. It's just surprisingly sad how evergreen some of these messages are that he's lifting up. What was his assessment towards the end of his life in terms of was he feeling like we were on an upward trajectory? Was he? I mean, you mentioned that, especially because of Vietnam, maybe he's feeling a little dejected in that moment. What would you say?
Yeah, he's not in a great place at the end of his life. He would often say, he's still an optimist despite. I can't remember. I don't always remember the quote. Despite his best inclinations, and he understood. That a lot of what he was arguing was not being fulfilled. He was very consumed and saddened by Vietnam, and the fact that at the time of his death, Vietnam is still going on. He's in a conference call shortly before he dies in December of 1972, and it's with a group of preachers who are working on the war, and he's incredibly saddened by the fact that in 72, this war is still very much raging, despite all of the protests that he had been involved in. And this is a traumatic moment in American history. Martin Luther King's assassination was devastating, personally devastating to him. Robert Kennedy had been killed. And I talk at the end of the book, and people can Google this. One of the final things he does is about 10 days before his death, he does an interview with a journalist named Carl Stern for a show called The Eternal Light, which was a show that featured Jewish culture on NBC. It's kind of a remarkable production of the time. And they interview him in this one-on-one conversation, which is pretty powerful. And Stern is asking him exactly what you're asking me. How could he still be so confident? How could he feel so good about, everything he's preached and written about, given the state of the world? And he talks about King's assassination. And even though he's sad, even though he's worn down, he continues to be strident with the message. And he says life isn't always moving in a progressive direction. And he says the world wasn't in 1972. But for him, that was not an excuse to stop all the kind of work that he was doing. He said, he used to say, we don't pray to be saved. We pray to be worthy to be saved, which I think is a really insightful way to think from his own words about who he is. And he ended that interview, even with all the negative stuff they talked about in the state of the world. Stern says, do you have a message for the young people of the country? And he says, let them remember that there is meaning beyond absurdity. Let them be sure that every little deed counts, that every word has power, and that we can, everyone, do our share, he said, to redeem the world in spite of all the absurdities and its frustrations and all the disappointments. And he ends by saying, and this is a quote that has stuck, above all, remember that the meaning of life is to build life as if it were a work of art. You are not a machine, and you are young. Start working on this great work of art called your own existence. And that's how we leave Heschel. So even though he was very despondent and sad, this was still in his heart, how he thought about the future.
It's incredible. I mean, in true form of the prophetic, there is rebuke with him, but there's always nechemta, there's always a redemptive ending. And the fact that he leaves us in that way is indicative of just how much he does end up embodying all that was best of that biblical tradition in a modern contemporary way.
Yes.
I'm keeping my eye on the time, and I want to be sure that I leave time for people to ask questions they might have. And so I wanted to just check in with Rabbi Berman. Do I have time for another question or two, or should we move on to others?
So it would be great for you to ask one more question, whether it's before or after our audience questions, but we have some really good audience questions.
Well, I'm all for good questions from other people. So why don't we go there first, and I'll have one more I want to ask before the end, I suppose.
Great. So we'll wrap up with you. The first question actually should be a fairly quick one. It's actually a detail about that interview you just mentioned. Is that available for folks to watch or listen to or read anywhere?
Yeah, it's on YouTube. Just Google it, or go to YouTube, and Carl Stern, Eternal Light, Heschel, it comes right up, and you can watch the whole thing. The whole show is on there. And if you're interested in Heschel, in addition to my book, it's really wonderful to watch that. And you can see physically he's ill. I mean, you can see it in his body, but it's I think it's quite a performance, and a good look into exactly the issue that we're just talking about, his state of mind toward the end.
You mentioned several times, Heschel's theological background and some of his teachings on theology, but would you take a moment and just talk about who was Heschel's God?
That's a good question. And this was actually a point of contention with him and many scholars and even religious scholars. Heschel believed in God. And I say this, meaning he believed God was real. He insisted that God was real. And he didn't agree with those, especially people he met in Berlin in the kind of highest intellectual circles, who were arguing God was a metaphor for something, or God represented something. He believed that God existed, and actually thought that was the premise for religion, that if you didn't believe that, a lot of the rest fell away. But his version of God was not a God that was above everyone and something that we as humans couldn't understand, the kind of God that Maimonides envisioned. Instead, he writes about a God with human pathos, who got angry, capable of love, could be frustrated, and a God that in some ways was vulnerable because God needed man. That was the premise of the book. The title gives it away. But God's search for man was because God needed man, and God couldn't repair the world unless there were those Hebrew prophets here who heard what God was so furious about and expressed that rage. So those are the two key elements, I think, of understanding how he thought of God and how it informed his writing.
Thank you. An interfaith question, of course, he's famous for his relationship with Dr. King, but Heschel also taught at Union Theological Seminary, a non-Jewish seminary, non-denominational, but coming really from a Christian perspective. What brought him to teach there? What was he trying to accomplish, and did he accomplish that?
Well, interfaith dialogue was very important to him. One moment you see it play out is between 1962 and 1965 during Vatican II, when the Vatican is revisiting doctrine that relates to other religions, including Judaism. And in the post-World War II era, post-colonialism era, they're rethinking controversial elements. And one is what parts of the doctrine have been connected to anti-Semitism. And the American Jewish Committee, someone there, Mark Tannenbaum, essentially selects Heschel to be a secret go-between the Vatican and the American Jewish community to work through these issues. Heschel forms a close relationship with a cardinal, and they meet a lot. And there's many theologians and religious leaders who think this is wrong, that Jewish leaders should not be involved in these sorts of conversations with the Vatican, that these theological questions should be kept separate, but he's already very insistent. He doesn't agree with that. And this becomes a big part of his life in the early 60s. The work in Vietnam, it was literally an interfaith group of clergy concerned about the Vietnam War. And the fact they are working across denominational lines, across faith-based institutions, he sees as very powerful, because in some ways, this question that he's wrestling with about how individuals can open themselves up to God is something he sees as universal. And since that's for him the principal question for Judaism, it's not simply about halakha. It's a conversation that could be had with other groups. And in 65, he gets invited to be a professor there for the year. First time there was a Jewish professor there. They actually have to change the laws. The board does, so that can happen. And Niebuhr is really the connective tissue. Their friendship and their alliance is so close that in addition to these big parts of the story I'm talking about, I think that friendship was part of how he ended up there, and why ultimately that became it's a principle that he's very invested in during that final decade.
I'm also very curious, and this is one of our one of our participants' questions. For your project, did you interview Dr. Susannah Heschel, Heschel's daughter, a prominent scholar and thinker in her own right? Did you speak with her? And if you did, how did that affect your understanding of Abraham Joshua Heschel?
Well, I did speak to her. I didn't interview her so much as we had a lovely breakfast in Boston, where she lives, shortly before the pandemic, actually. It was about 2 hours or probably more, where she told me different stories about her father and some more kind of personal touch, which is really what family members can offer beyond some of the bigger elements of the story that were more public. And so it was very helpful to spend that time with her and to hear her reminisce. I've also, in addition to our meeting, our meal, I've watched her videos, which are always helpful. I also spoke with many rabbis who either were friendly with him or who worked with him or had different kinds of encounters with him. And that was also very helpful, trying to get a flavor of the person, not just the persona. And so it's not the basis of my work. The basis of the work are archives. That's what I do as a professional historian. And his archives, which are at Duke University, are really superb. Because he was a professor, because he was a writer, he kept stuff, which is what historians are always hoping for. And he had little index cards where he write down thoughts that he had about life, about things he might want to write about. They're all there. He has this, can't remember how many pages, 6 or 7 page, somewhat like a memoir, a diary, when he's at that march in Selma, just recounting everything that's happening. And there was just incredibly rich material that way. His correspondence with many of the figures we've been talking about. And so my meeting with her was great. My meeting with other people who've known him was great. But for me, I'm an archive person, and that really became the basis of the story.
I want to acknowledge that there are many great questions in our chat box, but I think that is it from our audience questions. I want to give Rabbi Lorge the last question before we end tonight.
You've already, I think, in many ways left us with a sense of what Heschel's message and to us in this moment is some of the key takeaways we might walk away thinking about acting differently. And for that, I thank you. For the book, I thank you as well. But I wonder if you might just share, is there anything you felt after having, put the book together that, corrects maybe a misunderstanding about Heschel or something new that is in this book that isn't in other works? You mentioned Shai Held, and there are other books on Heschel. So what, is there something that you feel maybe is corrective that we read in this book, or something new that you discovered that you've unearthed?
I mean, two things for me which are different and were really important. One I've mentioned, one I haven't. The one I've mentioned is really, I hope readers come away with this thinking about his life story, especially those early decades, his writing as a theologian, as a public religious figure during the 1940s and 50s, and his activism, not as these different periods, not as if there's that Heschel, and then there's that Heschel, but they are really connected. And for me, that was a fresh way of looking at his writing, even seeing in the Sabbath, how does that connect to what he's doing at the end of his life in fighting Vietnam? And I think too often, different people take different pieces of this person and they're separated for us. And I'm hoping this more holistic biography is helpful in bringing that back. A second thing which people don't realize is before all the social justice fights and activism, he was just a very prominent figure in American life. He was written about in the 50s in Newsweek and Time magazine, and it's on lots of radio shows. And it's this remarkable moment for me, and it's not something I think people totally acknowledge, that there was space for someone writing about these kinds of questions, about God and humans, about spirituality and radical amazement, to be part of public conversations about religion and modern life. And that really came out as I was in the archives and seeing that, whoa, before Selma, he was a very well-known figure in American culture. And that's not just a corrective about Heschel, that he came out of nowhere when he spoke with King in '63, but I think it's a period for religious life that is really rich and intellectually robust, that I hope that's a roadmap for today, because I think it's a kind of conversation we don't have enough about. Someone like a Heschel who could force us to have a conversation about kind of what it means to be radically amazed at the trees that we see on the side of the street, and do it in a way that many people will listen, read, and think about. So those are the two parts of his story which really came out writing the book.
I want to thank everybody for being here with us this evening, everyone who has watched, everyone who has asked questions, everyone who has listened so closely. Rabbi Lorge, thank you for being our moderator and host. And Dr. Zelizer, thank you for speaking. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for putting this specific talk together for us. And thank you for writing this book.
Thanks so much. It was an honor to speak to all of you, and I hope to meet many of you soon.
Have a good evening, everybody.